On a distant world far from Earth, the human soldiers stepped down from their shuttle. The air was thick with tension, a strange, humid atmosphere unlike anything they had felt back home. The city stretched before them, alien and unfamiliar. Towering structures rose like jagged mountains, and the hum of machinery filled the air, mixing with voices that echoed through the streets. The soldiers were here on a peace mission, tasked with maintaining fragile relations between the human colonies and the various alien civilizations in the galaxy. This particular planet, Maltoria, was known for its ancient history and the sharp divide between its people, those loyal to the royal family and those who sought freedom from the crown's heavy hand. Human name, a young human soldier, walked alongside his comrades. His armor was sleek and polished, a symbol of humanity's strength, but beneath it, he felt like an outsider. He was used to the familiar faces and places of Earth, but this was something else entirely. He was ready to be diplomatic, to negotiate, to be respectful. But as the soldiers walked through the city, he felt something stirring within him: curiosity, fear, and maybe a little excitement. They approached the city square, where a gathering was taking place. Crowds of alien civilians stood in neat rows, their eyes locked forward. At the center of the square was a figure, a woman. She was surrounded by guards, but it was clear she was not a prisoner. She stood tall, her chin high as if daring the world to look at her. Her pale blue skin shone faintly under the harsh sunlight, a sharp contrast to the deep green armor she wore. Her eyes glimmered like two silver stars, intense and focused on something beyond the soldier's line of sight. Zelira, the woman at the center of it all, was of noble blood, but her presence here was no accident. She had been exiled by her own people. Her family had betrayed her, and her name had become one of shame. She had rejected the strict traditions that governed her world, and for that, she had been cast aside. She had chosen a life on the edge, away from the grand palaces and ceremonial halls, and now she stood in the open air, a symbol of defiance to her own kind. As Human Name walked closer, his eyes met hers. For a moment, the noise around them faded. Everything seemed to slow down. Her gaze was piercing, and yet there was something gentle in it, something that spoke to him without words. He could feel her presence, a force that was both fragile and unyielding. He had seen many alien species before, but none like her. "Who is she?" he asked one of the local guides. The guide glanced at him, as if unsure how to answer. "She is Zelira," the guide replied softly, as if speaking her name too loudly might draw attention. "She once held great power. Now she is nothing." Zelira stood, her posture unwavering, her eyes never leaving the distant horizon. She was a queen, though she had been stripped of her crown and her title. The people of Maltoria viewed her as a threat, a symbol of everything they feared, someone who dared to defy the traditions that had shaped their lives for centuries. And yet, as the crowd looked on, they were not cheering her downfall. They were watching her, waiting. Human Name couldn't help but feel a pull toward her. There was a sadness in her eyes that made him want to know her story, to understand why someone so regal had been reduced to this. He had seen war and hardship before, but never like this. Suddenly, a loud voice broke the silence. "Look at the human!" someone shouted from the crowd. "What does he know of our ways? Our traditions?" The voice was followed by a chorus of murmurs. The tension in the air was palpable. Human Name had been a soldier for years, but in this moment he felt completely out of his element. His mission was to keep the peace, to ensure that humanity's presence here would not escalate tensions. But now, with Zelira standing before him, the task seemed so much more complicated. The crowd grew louder, some voices filled with anger, others with curiosity. They seemed to resent the humans for even stepping foot on their world, and they hated that Zelira, of all people, had chosen to align herself with the humans. As Human Name stood there, unsure of what to say or do, he noticed something unusual. Zelira's eyes flicked toward him. There was something in that gaze, a flicker of recognition. It wasn't fear or hatred. It was something else, something unexpected. For a brief moment, Human Name thought he saw a soft smile cross her lips, though it was gone almost as soon as it appeared. Her expression was unreadable, but in that instant, he realized that he was not just an outsider to these people. He was an intruder in a battle he didn't understand. Before he could say anything, Zalira's guards moved toward her, positioning themselves around her as if to shield her from the growing unrest. But she made no move to resist. Instead, she turned her back to the crowd, quietly whispering something under her breath. Human Name couldn't hear the words, but something told him they were meant for him. He took a step forward, breaking the unspoken barrier that had formed between them, his mind racing with questions about the woman in front of him. Why had she been cast aside? What had happened to her that made her stand here, alone, in defiance of her own people? The answers were elusive, but one thing was certain. This was just the beginning of something far greater than he could have imagined. Zalira's footsteps echoed through the cold stone hallways as she was led through the grand palace, a prisoner in her own city. The guards kept their hands firmly on her arms, but she made no attempt to break free. Her eyes were locked forward, her face expressionless, though her mind raced with thoughts of defiance and sorrow. In the heart of Maltoria, beneath the towering spires of the royal palace, Zalira had once been a figure of great power. Her family, once respected throughout the galaxy, had nurtured her to become the future ruler of the planet. But that future was stolen from her the moment she rejected the traditions that governed her people. She had chosen love and freedom over the cold, unyielding laws that had shackled her people for centuries. Now her name was spoken only in whispers, a symbol of rebellion and dishonor. As she walked through the crowded streets, the people of Maltoria made their feelings clear. They had cast her aside as if she were nothing more than dirt beneath their feet. "Traitor," a voice shouted from the crowd. "You brought shame to our people." Zalira's steps faltered slightly, but she didn't look at the crowd. She had learned long ago that the only way to survive in Maltoria was to ignore the hate and remain strong in the face of it. The people jeered, throwing trash and debris at her, but Zalira held her head high, her chin tilted upwards, as if she were a queen once more, even though she no longer wore her crown. Among the shouts and insults, one voice stood out, soft but clear. "Zalira." She knew the voice immediately. It was Human Name, the human soldier who had saved her life, who had shown her kindness when others had turned their backs. She couldn't help but feel a wave of warmth flood through her chest at the sound of his name, even though she was surrounded by a sea of hatred. Her heart ached with longing as she thought of him. He was so far away, yet his presence felt like it was right there beside her. She whispered his name again, a small, tender sound that was only meant for her ears. The guards around her noticed the slight change in her demeanor. One of them, a tall alien with sharp, pointed features, sneered at her. "You still think of that human, don't you?" He spat. "He's not your savior. He's just a fool like the rest of them." Zalira clenched her fists, but she didn't respond. She knew that speaking back would only make things worse. The alien guards were watching her closely, and the last thing she needed was to provoke them further. She had seen what happened to those who resisted. They continued their march through the city, the crowd growing larger as they neared the center square. There, a makeshift platform had been erected for her public display. It was a common practice in Maltoria to humiliate traitors in front of the people, to remind them of the consequences of rebellion. Zalira was to be the latest example. She was pushed onto the platform. Her legs shook not from fear but from the exhaustion of everything she had endured. Her body ached, and her spirit had been crushed by the weight of her people's disdain. But she refused to break. The crowd roared as the ropes were fastened to her arms, securing her to the post. She stood there, her head held high, her gaze unwavering. She would not let them see her cry. She would not let them see her falter. From the distance, Human Name watched, hidden in the shadows. He had seen enough. The pain in Zalira's eyes cut through him like a blade, and he couldn't stand to see her like this. He had to do something. But what? He stepped forward, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and determination. The plan, had always been simple, to observe, to keep the peace. But now, seeing Zalira in such a state, those words felt hollow. What peace was there in a world where a woman could be treated like this simply because of her feelings? Human Name clenched his fists. He couldn't allow this to happen, not to her, not to anyone. He took a deep breath and moved through the crowd, trying to stay unnoticed. His training had taught him to blend in, to move with purpose and confidence. But today, his every step felt heavy, harder than the last. Every glance from the crowd felt like a challenge, an accusation. Yet he couldn't turn back. Not now. The crowd's anger intensified as they began chanting, "Shame, shame, shame." Zalira's heart sank as the chants grew louder, the voices blending into a deafening roar. She closed her eyes for a moment, retreating into herself. But in that silence she heard it, the softest whisper, like a breath on the wind. Human Name. Her eyes snapped open, and for the briefest moment, she allowed herself to believe that he was close, that he might come to her rescue. But she quickly dismissed the thought. She was no longer a princess, no longer the shining star of Maltoria. She was nothing more than a broken exile, a woman who had dared to love beyond the rules of her people. But the memory of his kindness, his protection, still burned bright within her. It was a small flame in the cold darkness, but it was enough to keep her going. In that moment, she whispered his name again, this time loud enough for the guards to hear. Human Name. It was a cry of defiance, a cry of hope. And though no one in the crowd could hear it, Human Name did. He had heard it clearly, like a call to action, like a promise. The time for waiting was over. The hours dragged on as Human Name stood in the shadows, hidden from the crowd's sight. His heart pounded with a mix of frustration and helplessness. He had never been trained to fight a system this deeply rooted. His mission was never meant to involve a fight for justice, especially not for someone like Zalira, an alien woman, exiled and rejected by her people. But he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. He had seen the cruelty in the way they treated her, the way the crowd mocked her, throwing trash at her like she was an animal. He couldn't accept that. Not for someone who had shown him nothing but kindness, someone who had defied everything, for a dream of freedom and love. Human Name took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing mind. He was no longer just a soldier here on a peace mission. He was a man who had witnessed the suffering of someone he had come to care about, a man who would not let this injustice continue. He turned to his fellow soldiers, who were still standing, at the back of the square, unsure of how to respond. They had been trained to observe, to avoid getting involved in the politics of alien worlds, but Human Name had seen enough. He approached one of the senior officers, Lieutenant Keegan, who was watching Zalira from a distance. "Lieutenant," Human Name said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. "We can't just stand here, we need to do something." Keegan turned to face him, his eyes narrowing. "You're right," he replied, his tone low and tense. "But, you know the protocol. We're here to observe, not interfere." "I know what the protocol says," Human Name shot back, his voice rising in frustration. "But we're not just standing by while they humiliate her. She's been abandoned by her own people. Do you think this is right?" Keegan hesitated, his eyes flicking over to the platform where Zalira stood chained, the crowd still hurling insults and trash. He knew Human Name was right, but it was hard to ignore the weight of their orders. The entire situation was complicated, and any wrong move could spark even more violence. "We're not supposed to get involved," Keegan repeated. But there was uncertainty in his voice. Human Name clenched his fists, anger boiling inside him. "I didn't sign up for this," he said through gritted teeth. "If I don't do something now, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Keegan looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but we need a plan. We can't just run in there and start shooting. That'll make everything worse. Then we'll do this carefully," Human Name said. He paused for a moment, thinking. "We need to get her out of there. It's not just about saving her from the crowd. It's about protecting her from the system. If we don't act now, the next time we see her, it might be too late." Keegan glanced around, then motioned for a few other soldiers to gather around. Together, they began discussing their options. They knew the risks. They were far from the rest of their team, and the alien authorities would not take kindly to human interference. The plan was simple, yet dangerous. They would break into the palace, disable the guards, and free Zalira. They would move quickly, before the authorities could react. Once they had her, they would get her off-world somewhere safe, where she wouldn't be hunted for her rebellion. Human Name took one last look at Zalira, her figure standing tall despite the ropes that bound her, her face a mix of defiance and sorrow. He had seen her whisper his name, a call for help that stirred something deep within him. He couldn't leave her behind, he couldn't let them win. "I'll get her," Human Name said, more to himself than to the others. His mind was already racing with the steps he needed to take. The soldiers nodded, preparing their equipment. They knew they were about to face a fight, against the alien guards, against the system that had oppressed Zalira for so long, but none of them were backing down. As they moved into position, Human Name felt his heart pounding in his chest. There was no turning back now. If they failed, Zalira would remain chained, a symbol of the very cruelty they had come to oppose. But if they succeeded, they would change everything. They would prove that no matter how powerful the system was, no matter how much the odds were stacked against them, they could still make a difference. Zalira was not just an alien woman. She was a symbol of hope, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the galaxy, and Human Name was determined to make sure her voice was heard. He wasn't going to let her stand alone any longer. The night sky above them was clear, and the stars seemed to watch over them, as if they knew what was at stake. Human Name took a deep breath and nodded to his team. It was time to act. The plan was set, and they would move quickly. Every second counted. The plan was set, and Human Name could feel his heart racing in his chest. Every step had to be perfect. There was no room for mistakes. The quiet hum of the city at night felt like a constant reminder of the danger they were about to face. They moved swiftly through the alleyways, shadows blending with the darkened streets. The soldiers were well trained, and though they had little experience with situations like this, their instincts kicked in. Human Name had never felt more alive, or more terrified. As they neared the palace, the structure loomed over them like a giant, imposing wall. Guards were scattered at strategic points, but they seemed less alert at night. It was their chance. Human Name gave a brief signal, and the team split into two groups. He would head straight to the platform where Zalira stood, while the others would work on distracting the guards and ensuring the escape route was clear. The soldiers moved with precision, like ghosts in the night. Zalira was still chained to the post in the center of the square, surrounded by guards. Her head was lowered, as though she had given up any hope of escape, but Human Name could see the spark in her eyes. She had not lost hope. She was still fighting in her heart, even if her body had been beaten down by the harshness of her punishment. As Human Name approached the platform, his mind raced. He had to act quickly. Too much time had passed, and he knew that once the guards realized what was happening, everything would change. They'd be caught, and it would be the end for both of them. The other soldiers were already in position, keeping watch on the movements of the guards. The palace was massive, and their every step was a potential risk. But Human Name had come too far to turn back now. "Zalira," he whispered, his voice low but firm. She looked up sharply, her eyes meeting his with a mix of surprise and disbelief. "Human Name?" Her voice cracked as if she had forgotten what it was like to speak. A tear escaped her eye, but she quickly wiped it away. "You came for me." "I'm here," he said, moving closer. He pulled a small device from his belt, one that would disable the chains holding her captive. It was a simple tool, but it would do the job. The moment the chains clicked open, Zalira's shoulders slumped in relief. She rubbed her wrists, raw from the long hours she had spent bound, and looked at human name. "I didn't think you would come," she said softly. "I couldn't leave you here," he replied, his voice filled with determination. He extended a hand to her. "Let's go. It's not safe here anymore." Zalira hesitated for a moment, her gaze darting around the square. She had spent so long in the palace, and though she had been cast aside, it was still a part of her life. But the look in human name's eyes, the way he was standing there offering her freedom, it was the only choice she had left. She took his hand. Without another word, they moved quickly, weaving through the shadows and toward the alleyways. Human name kept his eyes on the path ahead, aware that every second counted. There was no telling how long they had before the authorities would realize what had happened. They reached the hidden tunnel that the soldiers had prepared for the escape. It was narrow, dark, and smelled of old stone and dust. It wasn't ideal, but it was their only way out. Zalira was already running beside him, her face set with determination. Behind them, the palace began to stir. They could hear the distant sounds of alarms, the hurried steps of guards realizing something was wrong. They had minutes, maybe less, before the entire city was on alert. As they sprinted through the tunnel, human name kept his focus sharp. Oh. He knew they couldn't afford to be caught, especially with Zalira by his side. But there was a nagging feeling at the back of his mind. What if this didn't work? What if the plan failed? "Keep going," Zalira said, her voice breathless, but steady. She must have felt the same fear, but she was pushing through it just as he was. "They won't stop us now." Human name nodded, his grip tightening around her hand. He wasn't sure if he believed her words, but he had to. If he didn't, they would never escape this place. They reached the end of the tunnel, and there, waiting for them, was the rest of the team. The soldiers were ready to move, their transport ships hovering just beyond the city limits, hidden in the shadows of the cliffs. The ships would take them to safety, far away from Maltoria, to a place where they could start over. But just as they were about to board the ship, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnel. "Move," human name shouted, pulling Zalira with him toward the ship. The other soldiers were already inside, weapons ready, preparing to defend their escape. Zalira's eyes widened as the sound grew louder. "We're almost there," she whispered. "We can make it." With one final sprint, they jumped onto the ship, and the hatch closed behind them, sealing them in the safety of the transport. Human name exhaled a breath he hadn't realized. He had been holding. They had made it. For now, they were safe. As the ship lifted off into the night sky, leaving the city behind, human name turned to Zalira. Her face was bruised, her body weary, but her eyes were filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the engines. "You don't need to," human name replied. "We're in this together now." And as the stars stretched out before them, Zalira felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The hope that, no matter the odds, they would find a way to live free. Together. The ship soared through the night sky, leaving the planet Maltoria behind. Inside the transport, human name sat beside Zalira, his mind still racing. They had made it out of the palace, out of the city. They were free, for now. But he knew the dangers were far from over. The authorities wouldn't let them go so easily. The chase had only just begun. Zalira sat quietly next to him, her gaze lost in the stars outside. Though she had been freed from her chains, she still carried the weight of her past with her. The life she had known on Maltoria, the wealth, the power, the family, was gone. The people who had once called her princess now saw her as a traitor. She was no longer welcome in her own home. "I never thought I'd leave Maltoria like this," Zalira murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Human name turned to look at her, his expression softening. "I know it's hard, but we'll figure this out. You won't be alone anymore." Zalira nodded, but there was sadness in her eyes. The world she once knew was gone, and it was difficult for her to imagine a future where she was truly free. For so long she had been told what to do, how to think, and who she should be. Now she was forced to redefine herself, to find her place in a galaxy that didn't seem to have a place for her. The ship's engines hummed steadily as they continued their journey. Human Name sat in silence, trying to calm the storm in his mind. They had successfully escaped, but he knew the alien forces would not give up so easily. Maltoria was a powerful planet, and its leaders would stop at nothing to recapture Zalira. He could already imagine the propaganda they would spread, painting her as a criminal, a disgrace to her people. And worse, they would likely blame humanity for stirring up trouble. Suddenly, the ship's radar beeped, breaking the tense silence. The pilot, one of Human Name's allies, looked up from the controls, his face tense. "We've got company," he said. The words hit Human Name like a punch to the gut. He quickly stood up, moving toward the control panel. "What kind of company?" The pilot's hands flew over the controls, checking the readings. "Maltorian fighters. They've picked up our signal. We're being tracked." Zalira's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "They found us already?" Human Name nodded grimly. "They won't give up. We need to shake them before they catch up." The ship's engines roared as the pilot began evasive maneuvers. The transport shook as they turned sharply, trying to dodge the incoming enemy ships. Human Name gripped the side of the seat, his heart pounding. He had been in tight situations before, but this felt different. This time, there was no backup. There was no one to help them if things went wrong. The sky outside the ship was suddenly filled with flashes of light as the Maltorian fighters opened fire. The first blast rocked the ship, throwing everyone off balance. Human Name, quickly, strapped himself into a seat next to Zalira, his eyes never leaving the radar. "We can't outrun them forever," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "We need a plan." Zalira looked at him, her eyes flashing with determination. "What? If we turn and fight back, we're not helpless." Human Name hesitated. He knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. The Maltorian fleet was one of the most advanced in the galaxy. Fighting them would be a risk they couldn't afford to take. But then he remembered the training he had received, the tactics he had learned as a soldier. He could fight. He had to. "Hold on," Human Name said, turning to the pilot. "Prepare to engage." The pilot nodded, his face a mask of focus. "You got it. I'll give them a fight they won't forget." The ship veered sharply to the side, dodging another barrage of fire. Human Name moved to a small weapons station on the ship, quickly securing himself in position. He had used these weapons before in training, but never under such pressure. His fingers hovered over the controls as he took aim at one of the Maltorian fighters that was closing in. "On my mark," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. "Get ready." Zalira, who had been sitting silently beside him, now turned to him, her expression serious. "You're going to do this. I know you are." Human Name gave her a quick glance. "We'll do this together." The tension in the air was thick as the Maltorian ships closed in. The radar showed multiple blips, signaling the approaching danger. Human Name took a deep breath, steadying his hands. With a quick movement, he fired the first shot. The energy blast shot out from the ship, hitting one of the fighters and sending it spiraling out of control. "Yes," the pilot shouted, exhilarated. "They're backing off." But the victory was short-lived. More Maltorian fighters appeared on the radar, and the ship was once again surrounded. Human Name fired again, his aim steady, but the number of enemy ships was overwhelming. It was clear they couldn't keep this up for long. "We need to get to the atmosphere," Human Name said, his voice sharp. "We can't stay out here. The ship's shields won't hold much longer." The pilot nodded, turning the ship toward the planet. "Hang on. We're going in hot." The ship plunged toward the atmosphere, the Maltorian fighters hot on their tail. Human Name knew they couldn't outrun them forever. But as they dove toward the planet, a new hope sparked inside him. They might not be safe yet, but they were going to fight for every second they had. And that in itself was something. The ship dipped lower into the atmosphere, shaking as it entered the turbulent clouds above Maltoria. The sound of the engine struggling to maintain control filled the cabin. Human Name gripped the side of his seat, watching the monitors closely. They were now flying through a storm, a literal one, and the enemy fighters were still close, behind. "We can't keep this up much longer," the pilot said, his voice strained as he worked the controls. "The shields are at 30%. They won't hold if we take another hit." Zalira sat beside Human Name, her hands clutching the armrest. She looked out the window, her eyes scanning the dark sky. She had never seen her world like this, violent, chaotic, and far from the regal city where she had once belonged. The realization hit her hard. She was no longer a princess. She was an outlaw, an outcast. Her life would never be the same, and there was no turning back. But as she looked over at Human Name, sitting beside her, she found a strange comfort in his presence. Despite everything they had gone through, he was still with her. His courage, his quiet strength. It gave her hope. For the first time since her exile, Zalira allowed herself to believe that there might be a way out, that there was a future for her beyond the confines of Maltoria. "Hang in there, Zalira," Human Name said, his voice calm but determined. "We'll make it through this just a little longer." The ship jolted again as another blast hit the rear shields. The pilot cursed under his breath. "We've got incoming. They're not giving up." Human Name turned toward the radar, his mind working quickly. They were outnumbered, but he wasn't about to let them get caught. The enemy fighters were closing in, and the time to act was now. He motioned to the pilot. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers. We need to shake them off." The pilot nodded, quickly adjusting the course. "I'm taking us through the canyon. It's narrow, but it'll give us some cover." "Do it," Human Name said. The ship banked sharply to the right, entering a narrow canyon that cut through the rugged terrain of Maltoria. The sound of the wind howling outside was deafening as they sped between the towering cliffs, the rocky walls scraping dangerously close on either side. The Maltorian fighters followed them, but they struggled to keep up in the confined space. Zalira's heart raced and her hands tightened on the armrest. The canyon was their only chance, but it was also a risk. One wrong move, and they would be trapped. "We've got to make it through this," Human Name muttered to himself. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for Zalira, for her future, and for the hope that they could both live free. Suddenly the ship lurched forward as a blast hit the ship's tail. The lights flickered and alarms blared. The pilot's face turned pale as he worked to keep the ship steady. "The engines are losing power. We won't be able to make it much longer." Zalira's breath caught in her throat. They were running out of time. "We have to outrun them. Do whatever it takes," Human Name ordered. The pilot nodded, his hands flying over the controls. The ship twisted and turned, dodging more blasts as they sped through the canyon. The Maltorian fighters were relentless, but the terrain was on their side. The cliffs narrowed ahead, and the ship had to make a sharp turn to avoid smashing into the rocks. "Now," Human Name shouted. The pilot yanked the controls to the side, sending the ship hurtling to the left. The ship skidded dangerously close to the canyon wall, scraping against the stone. But they made it through. For a brief moment, there was silence. The only sound was the hum of the engines. The ship had escaped, barely. But then, through the rear view screen, they saw it. Another ship, larger, faster, and this time it wasn't just one fighter. The Maltorian fleet had sent their elite forces to finish the job. "Get ready," Human Name said, his voice cold with determination. "We're not done yet." Zalira looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "What are we going to do? We can't outrun them anymore." Human Name met her gaze, his expression firm. "We're going to fight." The ship rocked again as another blast hit the shields. The battle was far from over, and the odds were stacked against them. But in that moment, Human Name made a decision. He would not let Zalira fall back into the hands of the Maltorian forces. He would do whatever it took to ensure her freedom. The elite Maltorian ship closed in, its weapons primed and ready. Human Name and the pilot both knew they had only one option left. It was a gamble, but it was their best shot. "Brace yourselves," the pilot yelled, slamming the ship into overdrive. The ship shot forward, hurtling toward the oncoming enemy vessel. The elite ship fired, but Human Name wasn't about to let them win. He pulled the ship into a tight barrel roll, narrowly avoiding the blast. The moment felt like a lifetime, and the world seemed to move in slow motion. Human Name focused entirely on the ship ahead, calculating his next move. "This is it," he said quietly, and then with one final twist of the controls, he sent the ship into a dive. The ship plummeted toward the ground, threading between the rocky terrain, all the while staying just ahead of the enemy's fire. The sound of the engines roaring filled the cabin, and for a moment, Human Name and Zalira were weightless. It was a feeling of sheer freedom, the kind that came only when you fought for your life. The ship shot through a narrow gap in the canyon walls, dodging another blast from the pursuing fighters. Human Name smiled grimly. They had a chance. They weren't done yet. The ship continued to race through the canyon, weaving in and out of narrow gaps in the rocky cliffs. The sound of the engines echoed against the walls, and Human Name kept his focus sharp. He had never been in a situation like this before, but the adrenaline was keeping him alert. Every turn, every twist of the ship was a matter of life or death. There was no turning back now. Zalira sat beside him, her grip tight on the armrest. Her eyes were wide with both fear and hope. Despite everything they had been through, despite the danger, she had never felt more alive. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long while she believed that there could be a future for her. One that wasn't defined by the chains that once held her. "You're doing great," Human Name said, glancing at her with a reassuring smile. "We're almost there. Just hang on a little longer." Zalira gave a small nod, though she didn't say anything. She wasn't sure if she believed him, but she trusted him. She had to. He had come for her, risked everything for her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. The Maltorian elite ship was still hot on their tail, firing blasts in an attempt to catch them. Human Name had been dodging their shots, but the pressure was building. The canyon was narrowing, and the ship was nearing its limits. Their only hope now was to reach the escape route the soldiers had set up ahead, where they could leave Maltoria far behind. "We can't keep this up forever," the pilot said, his voice tense. "If we don't reach the exit soon, we'll be sitting ducks." Human Name nodded, his grip tightening on the controls. The exit was close, just beyond the next stretch of canyon. But the enemy ships were closing in and time was running out. "We need to make it through that opening," Human Name said, his eyes locked on the narrow gap ahead. It was their only chance. The pilot glanced at him, fear in his eyes. "It's too narrow. We might not fit." "We don't have a choice," Human Name replied, determination in his voice. "We'll make it, trust me." He pushed the controls forward, sending the ship into a sharp turn. The canyon walls loomed dangerously close, but Human Name didn't flinch. He had to trust his instincts now. It was all or nothing. The ship hurtled toward the narrow opening, the enemy fighters just behind them. The blast from one of the ships barely missed, the shockwave rattling the ship as it squeezed through the gap. The sound of the ship's engines roaring filled the cabin, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. Then, with a burst of speed, the ship shot through the opening, leaving the canyon behind. They were free. The Maltorian ships, unable to follow, pulled back in defeat. The crew let out a collective sigh of relief as the ship soared into the clear night sky. Human Name looked at Zalira, his eyes filled with a quiet pride. They had done it. They had escaped. Zalira's face softened as she looked at him, a sense of awe in her eyes. "I never thought I'd make it out of there." "You did," Human Name said, his voice steady. "We did." The pilot, still catching his breath, grinned. "I think we might have just made history, huh?" Zalira smiled faintly. For the first time since her exile, she felt something that had been missing for so long: hope. The future was uncertain, but with Human Name by her side, it felt possible. The ship continued to climb higher into the atmosphere, leaving the planet behind. As the stars began to fill the sky, Zalira looked out at the endless expanse before them. She knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, dangers, and enemies that would try to stop them. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of freedom. A sense of possibility. "We're going to be all right," Zalira said, her voice quiet but strong. Human Name looked at her, his gaze soft. "I know we are." As the ship moved further into space away from Maltoria, Zalira felt a deep sense of relief wash over her. She had been through so much, and yet here she was, alive, free, and with someone who cared. They didn't know where the road ahead would lead. But as the stars shone brightly above them, Zalira realized that they had already taken the first step toward something new. Together, they would face whatever came their way, and no matter what happened, they would never be alone again.